Should be
Yeah.
okay. Right, it looks like we are live. So bear with us, guys, if you're just joining us now. We're in another great Q&A. We got Karl Gruner in, which is our recent interview. He flew the F-111A and F, and also the F-16C. So yeah, Karl, what's been happening on your side since we last talked?
Well, I got hired for a new job for one thing at
Oh
Eggman Air
wow.
Force Base in Florida. So it's not in Orlando where I live in Orlando. So it's that's kind of a little bit inconvenient, but it's going to be pretty exciting. So I'm going there on Sunday afternoon to start working on Monday, and I'll be working with weapons ballistics, and so basically a software program to um, to compute weapons ballistics, employment characteristics, employment speeds, tactics, all kinds of stuff like that that have to do with aircraft weapons employment. So I'm
So
looking
yeah, like
forward to it.
I knew you were retired, but why did you decide to go back? Kind of that route. Were you just bored, or did you? Was there a new challenge
Yeah,
for
I
you?
think some of it is that, although I have three young kids, so I wasn't really bored, is not the right way, but I was kind of missing the interaction. I have to tell you, I love working in, aviation related fields, even if it's not actually flying. And so, and part of it is also, of course, it's extra money too. So, so
Always helps,
I
doesn't
mean,
it?
I'm doing okay as a retiree, it's fine, but I want to buy that new Corvette. So, uh,
There you go. Yeah. So thanks for joining us, folks. Obviously, get your questions coming in for Karl. But yeah, Karl, can you just give us a couple of minutes on your background, just so people, if they haven't seen the interviews, of what you flew and your a bit about your career.
yeah, so the first thing is people, if they haven't seen your videos that you already posted, my background is French American. So I grew up in France. That's why the accent is there. It's French, actually. But after graduating high school in France, I went to the U.S., attended college in the U.S., went through the Reserve Officer Training Corps in the Air Force ROTC, and then ended up getting a commission, went to pilot training in Texas, in Lubbock, Texas, at what was then Reese Air Force Base, and got selected to fly the F-111 from there. After about 6 years, a little less than 6 years in the F-111, I went to be a ground air liaison officer in Germany with the U.S. Army. And after that, I got selected to go fly the F-16. So these are the two aircraft, besides, of course, the training aircraft, T-37, T-38, that I flew in the Air Force, F-111, F-16, specifically F-111A, and F model, and the F-16C model. I've never flown an F-16A. So, these
Yeah,
are
I
the
actually I posted up a photo. I think of one of the squadrons. Where you were based at Han, and someone was like, "Oh, that's an F-16A model, Block 15." I was like, "Oh, I thought they were all C's when you went to Han."
No, well, Han first converted from the F4 to the F-16A first,
Right.
but then by the time I showed up at Han in May 1988, it was like the end of May 1988. They had already all converted from the A model to the C model. So when I went to Luke, I attended, like I told you, 4 months of training at Luke Air Force Base in Phoenix, Arizona, and that was already in the C model. So I never actually flew an A model ever.
And what was the main differences between the A and the C? Why we get the questions coming in?
Well, the avionics was really the big difference. Actually, the first C models had the same engine as the A model. Like the Block 25 that I flew at Han had the same engine, um, but uh, but they had completely new cockpit design. And as a matter of fact, for European listeners who are familiar with the F-16 AM, that used to be A models, but they were converted with the midlife upgrade to the AM models. That's the same kind of cockpit with the two uh, multifunction displays that at the time were still monochrome, so black and green. Now they have even more advanced versions in full color and all that, but that's something different. I never flew those, but Um, so the A model, the avionics was really the big difference. The radar was different too. The A model had APG 66. The C model brought in the APG 68, which was more advanced, better, longer range, more functions. So it was better from that point of view. But other than that, the structure was stronger too, so they had a higher possible maximum gross weight to carry more stuff. And the main reason was eventually the C model was, carrying the lantern pods, so it had the chin inlet, the hard points, I guess you can call them that, which the A model did not have. But mostly in the terms of avionics. And let's say the cockpit configuration was quite different and much better actually, tell you the
Brilliant.
truth.
Well, as you can see there, Carl, there's a few questions coming in. So
Yeah,
if you
they're
just
already,
work your way from the top,
yeah, they're
enjoy, and
already
folks,
questions.
get your questions coming in.
Yeah, well, so the first question, so how many, well, that's an easy one. How much better in the air to ground roll was the F-16 when the F-111 than the F-111 in the air to air roll? Well, the F-111 in the air to air roll was already not very good. Okay, so um, that's a pretty simple one. The F-16 was better in some ways than the F-111 in the air to ground roll, but in some other ways it wasn't as good. So the big difference, of course, the F-111 could carry a lot more ordnance. And then I have to make a big difference between, let's say, the F-111A, which was pretty much limited to conventional ordnance, unguided weapons, compared to, say, the F model, which could designate its own laser-guided weapons. So the F-16 was actually more accurate in general with unguided weapons, but the F-111 can carry a lot more and can carry it a lot farther. So, but in air-to-air, the F-111 extremely limited to basically defensive measures and pretty much nothing else. Oh well, so let's see. I have a lot of questions coming in. Try to see if I can keep up. The next one was it Shiny Baldy? Taiwanese fully updating F-16 to the F-16V blood. How long do you think the F-16 will continue to be in active service? Oh, yeah, another 20 years. That's what he said. Yeah, probably more than that. I would say probably closer to 30 years. It's a fantastic aircraft, and then the F-16V has a active electronically scanned array radar, so AESA, and it's going to be very, very relevant for the foreseeable, well, very long time. There's a lot of newer versions of the F-16s that I never got to fly, that have like conformal external fuel tanks, new radars, and are much, much better than what I used to fly. So what's the big difference? So this is Ricky Palacios. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. What was the big difference between the F-111A and the F-111F? I addressed that in the video, but the two big differences were A, the engines. The F-111F had TF30s, so the same basic engine, but 40% more thrust. That was very significant. And then the other significant difference were the avionics, and particularly, now, the F-111F, when it first came in service, did not have this, but by the time I flew it, we had what's called the PAVE-TAC system, which was a laser designator and forward infrared looking designator pod. And of course, that was a huge difference because it allowed us to designate our own laser guided weapons for self-delivery. So these were the two big differences: the avionics, including the PAVE-TAC, and the engine thrust. From a handling perspective, other than the thrust, they were pretty much the same. The flight control system was the same. Okay. So the next question, Timberwolf, do you have any stories from combat or even red flag training events you would like to talk about? Well, in one of the video, in the F-111 video, I talked about my first red flag mission, so I'm not going to repeat myself here. But I could talk about another red flag mission, which was dropping live ordnance at night at red flag. So on that one, it was during the same red flag it was my very first red flag, but I was tasked to drop 8 Mark 82 live bombs at night on one of the red flag ranges. And on that one, we were flying in a formation. But once you were at night, basically what you would do an 8-mile trail formation. So my lead was 8 miles in front of me, and I'm flying the same track. And what was interesting about that one is we were ingressing at 200 feet at night. The weather was good, so no clouds, but 200 feet over the desert floor at night at 540 knots, so about 600 miles per hour in statute miles. And we had to climb up to 1,000 feet to drop the bombs because these were slick bombs, so they did not have any retardation device like a parachute or fins. So those had to be dropped from a higher altitude, so you would not fly inside your own fragmentation pattern from the bomb. So we had to climb up from 200 feet to 1,000 feet, drop the bombs, and then go back down. And I could see the flash of the bombs. The visibility to the rear of the F-111 was not very good. But still, even then, you could see the bright flash of the bombs exploding behind you. And then we went back down to 200 feet for egress. So next question. I have many more stories, but of course I can't take the whole time talking about stories because we'd be here for the next 5 hours. So, let's see. And I never flew. Just to be clear, I went in combat, but I only went in combat as a ground forward air controller. I never flew in combat in either the F-111 or the F-16. I was at Lakenheath during the El Dorado Canyon raid, but I did not fly on that raid. So I knew everybody that went, but I myself did not fly on the raid. So let's see. What do we have here for a question? So Josh Bayless, I guess, asks, what squadron were you in at Lakenheath, and how much banter was there between all the squadrons? So at the time, Lakenheath had 4 squadrons, the 492nd, 493rd, 494th, and 495th fighter squadrons. The 495th was more of a training squadron that facilitated transition from other models to the F model. And I did go through that, but only for about 3 months. And it probably actually less than that. But then I ended up operationally, I was attached to I went to the 492nd Fighter Squadron, the Bowlers, and that's where I stayed for the rest of my tour at Lakenheath. And how much banter? Well, there's always banter between the different squadrons. I mean, that's kind of common, but it wasn't, it was very friendly overall. There was no, everybody knew that the other squadrons were, all very professional. We all did the same mission. Interesting stories at Lakenheath when I was there. The 493rd Fighter Squadron had a specialized mission with a GBU-15 glide bomb, which was a TV-guided glide bomb. So they were the only squadron out of the 4 there with that specific mission. So that was the one difference. Everybody else was doing laser-guided bombs, basically. 493rd were doing the GBU-15. What was the heaviest load? And this is the Freckle Puny, I guess. What was the heaviest load you ever carried on an F-111 or witnessed? Ooh, I don't know. I guess it's probably. I mean, I've seen pictures. I don't think I've actually I think I've seen it loaded, but only for like static display purposes, never flying it with 20 Mark 82s. So that would be the 20 500-pounders. So that's 10,000 pounds of ordnance, actually a little bit more. But I've never seen anybody fly with that. Typically, we flew with ordnance either 8 or 12 Mark 82s on the outer pylons, or 4 Mark 84s, or the laser guided equivalent Mark 84, like a GBU 10 on the 4 wing pylons. So it would be 8,000 pounds of ordnance. In theory, the aircraft could carry a lot more. Could carry 24 Mark 82s, and I've seen pictures of it, but in practice, we never did. Too much drag and too much weight. So, hope that answers that question. Let's see. Orion asks, what was the toughest BFM matchup for the F-16 out of all the jets you flew against? That's a tough one. I mean, I would say another F-16, but I'm pretty sure you mean against other types of aircraft. So, and again, I never flew against an F-14B or D, which would have had the big engines, which would have been a lot tougher than the A model to fight against. But I would say probably the F-15, I guess, of all the aircraft I flew against. I think it was a very good aircraft. And I mentioned if it was BFM particularly, because that's 1v1. So in DACT, the fact that the F-16 was much smaller than the F-15 was a big advantage for the F-16, because that's multiple aircraft flying, and it's much tougher to keep track of where all your adversaries are. It's even hard to keep track of where all the good guys are. But the F-15 on a 1v1 match was actually quite powerful, quite maneuverable at low speeds, a little bit better than the F-16. And so to me, in a BFM, probably the F-15, I would say. But it's close, I mean, it's hard to say because the pilots in a lot of the cases made the biggest differences. I can tell you it was a lot different fighting against, let's say, an average line pilot compared to fighting, let's say, a fighter weapons school grad. I remember this guy, Gary Harris. He was one of my instructors. He was a FWIC grad in the Air Force F-16. I could never beat him. I mean, I as hard as I tried, and this was F-16 against F-16, but I just could never beat him. He was very, very, very good. I mean, it's just, but he went to fighter weapons school for a reason. So, so the pilot a lot of time makes the biggest difference. And I would right now say 1v1 F-15, but the F-18 was very good too. F-14, if flown very well, could be very dangerous as well. Like if you won in a one circle fight against an F-14 in an F-16, that probably was a big mistake, and you could lose. Somebody asked about the sword behind me. Well, that's a replica of the TV show. This Long Claw. So Jon Snow's sword is just a replica. And, I'm not going to get into it. If you want to get in touch with me, see how I got it, I mean, that's available online and stuff like that. That's from Game of Thrones. Sorry, I forgot to mention the name of the title on the TV series, but Game of Thrones. So next question, 999 Razor, F-16 versus Mirage 2000 initial turn. Now, initial turn rate, the Mirage 2000 is better for sure. The advantage of the F-16 is a sustained turn rate. The Mirage 2000 has a very impressive turn rate for like first 90 degrees to 180 degrees, but after that, it kind of peters out. It just doesn't have the power to sustain the turn. And also, the delta wing is a disadvantage, period, because it has a lot of induced drag. So even with fly-by-wire, which makes it better, it's still a disadvantage. So delta wings are not great. Delta wings are great for instantaneous turn rate. They're never great for sustained turn rate. I mean, unless you can provide a lot of power like the Rafale and the Typhoon now, have delta wings with canards, but they do have a lot of power, so they are able to make up for the delta wing. But the delta wing is never an advantage for sustained turn rate. So. But yeah, Mirage 2000, very dangerous in the first part of the engagement. You have to watch it for sure. Okay, which block of F-16 did you fight the Mirage 2000? Block 25, C model block 25. Which actually, the block 25, a lot of people, to me, I thought it was a fantastically powerful and maneuverable aircraft. But some of the pilots I flew with it had flown the A model, thought the block 25 was like the worst F-16 from a pure maneuverability point of view. It had the same engine as the A model, but weighed about 2,000 pounds more. It was, I guess, in relative terms. But again, I can't speak to that from personal experience because I never flew the A model. And then later C models had even more powerful engines, like the GE engine, or some of the later, like the 229 or 129 versions of the the GE and Pratt and Whitney engine, respectively, have much more power. But I fought against the Mirage 2000, the Block 25, which had the old Pratt and Whitney -200 engines, and was the heavier F-16 at that point. Strong points, Mirage. Well, basically, Mirage 2000, I already mentioned that better in the first 180-degree turn, the Mirage 2000 is going to be superior. And after that, the F-16 is going to be superior. Certainly superior in the vertical. F-16 has much more power. The low speed, if you got really slow against a Mirage 2000 and F-16, that probably did not mean a good outcome for you, because the Mirage 2000 at low speeds, let's say below 200 knots, was overall better than the F-16. So acceleration, definitely F-16 easily superior. Climb rate, F-16 superior. Mirage 2000, the engine was good, but the thrust to weight ratio is not close to what an F-16 has. Even the Block 25, which is one of supposedly the worst F-16. So the Eric Middleton asks, were you ever bounced by RAF aircraft? Yes, and I mentioned that in my F-111 video. That there's two types of bounces. At low altitude, over Germany or over the UK, very often you had encounters with various types of airplanes that were also flying at low altitude. Some of them just ignored you. When I was flying in the F-111, our best response was to keep going fast and try to avoid them. Definitely, I would not turn unless it was a last-ditch defensive maneuver, and the aircraft was getting in a position where they could shoot a AIM-9 or even gun us. But given our speed, typically now in peacetime, you had speed restriction, like you could not go supersonic, obviously, over land. So there was only so much you could do. But you have to remember the F-111, we typically flew for training in a clean configuration. When I say clean, still had the wing pylons and some of the multiple ejection racks. Whereas most other airplanes typically had external tanks, so that was a huge advantage for us, because that was a disadvantage as far as their maximum speed. But still, there's not much you can do. In the F-16, it was a completely different story, because in the F-16 you could react. And as fact, one of the things we did in the F-16, the radar. In the F-111, we always flew with the radar in the air-to-ground mode, because in the air-to-air mode, there was an air-to-air mode, but it was terrible. It was not very good. It was, you could use it for certain things, but very, very limited. In the F-16, different story. Doppler radar, at low altitude, we flew with it in air-to-air mode all the time until you got pretty close to the target. Then you would switch to the air-to-ground mode. So we could detect other aircraft typically before they could pick us up on the radar. Now, at low altitude, there are limitations because of terrain. Obviously the radar cannot see behind a mountain or a hill. So, if you're flying very low, that automatically is going to limit the radar range. But nevertheless, it was a big help. And typically we we could pick up most of the aircraft on the radar before they could see us, and that would allow us to either avoid them or take appropriate measures to put us in an advantageous position by the time we merged with them. So, yeah, but RAF aircraft, yeah, very often. But a couple of times I got bounced by them in the Wash ATA in the UK. That was at higher altitude. And I talked about this in my F-111 video, engaging F4s, RAF F4s at medium to high altitude. And, it was no contest. The F4 was, even though third generation aircraft, so it would not even compare to an F-15 or F-16 or Mirage 2000, was still easily superior to the F-111 in a turning fight. I mean, I was pretty much reduced to defensive maneuvers very, very quickly. So let's see. Next question. Oh, I got Ricky Palacios. I'm glad I got your name right. So now Alexander Vata, if he's German, is Vata, I guess, but Vader or Vader. What was the best and the worst part of being based in Germany? I don't know. I can't think of a lot of worst parts. It was all great. In fact, I had taken German in high school and a little bit in college, but because I had not practiced it in many, many years, I kind of lost a lot of it. But being back in Germany, immersed myself in the culture and the language, and now I speak fluent German. Well, fluent. I mean, I do have limitations. It depends on me, but for the everyday conversation, you could say fluent German. From 20 years in Germany over the year. I mean, I lived there a little bit as a kid because my dad was in the army and was stationed in Germany for a while. But as an adult in the Air Force, I lived there quite a long time. After I retired from the Air Force in 2003, I stayed in Germany for another 9 years as a contractor in the Ramstein area. So, yeah, I loved it. I can't think of a lot of bad parts. I mean, when I lived in the UK, one of the things you could say was sort of bad, even though it was not a big deal, was I had to adapt to driving on the left side of the road or the wrong side of the road, I would say. But the fact is, in Germany, I truly enjoyed my time there. I made some great friends among the German population. We were well received, particularly. Well, pretty much anywhere I worked in Germany, and I don't know. I mean, I loved it. In some ways, I kind of miss it. I wish sometimes I miss, but there's a lot of good stuff here in Florida too. So there's pros and cons to everywhere. The key is to just make the best of where you live and like just accept it. And there's always, but flying in Germany until they raised the low-level limit to 1,000 feet in September 1990 was just totally awesome too. It was fantastic. So now we're back to the Freckle Puny. How much space do you have in the F-111 ejection capsule compared to the ejection seat in the F-16? That's a great question, actually. So both had pros and cons. So the big pros on the F-111 ejection capsule, first of all, it worked really well. Now, I had never ejected in either aircraft, so just that as a caveat. But I've known plenty of people. Like when I was at Mountain Home for 2.5 years, we had 4 ejections when I was there. All of them made it out. The worst case is, unfortunately, there was a malfunction in part of the capsule, which was the airbag that softened the impact when the capsule hit the ground. And the wing commander who was flying the aircraft ended up being paralyzed from the waist down. His Wizzo, Scott Springer, was in better shape, but he ended up never flying ejection seat aircraft again in his career. So he kept flying, but in non-ejection seat aircraft. Because he hurt his back pretty bad, but at least he was able to walk. So that's the worst part. But that was due to a malfunction, actually, which was traced to faulty maintenance. And actually, there was a lawsuit, and I don't want to get into this, but that was unusual. Most of the time, it worked great. So the advantage is you could eject supersonic. You could eject over very cold water and didn't have to wear a immersion suit. You could eject supersonic, no problem. You'd be just fine, which was not the case in an F-16. On the other hand, if you ejected inverted or in a very high sink rate, the minimum limits for ejection, for safe ejection, were much higher. To give you an idea, in the F-111, to eject fully inverted with a 0 sink rate, the minimum ejection altitude was 1,500 feet. So if you ejected inverted, fully inverted below that, you might not make it. And I know one case where the guys did make it, ejecting like right above that, right after takeoff. They had an engine fire at Mountain Home and ejected at right above 1,500 feet, and they got like the chutes opened and they impacted right after. They walked out of it, but that was a close call. Whereas in the F-16, you could eject at 200. Well, depending on your speed, but if you were having any kind of significant forward speed, you could eject at 200 feet inverted and still make it. So that's a big, big difference. On the other hand, if you ejected supersonic in the F-16, your chances of making it out alive were not great. So pros and cons. So next question. That's Okisoba. Did you process any air support requests during your Gulf War FAC tour? Yes, I mentioned that in my original interview. I think it's in the F-16 part. I did control. There was about a full 24 hours where I was on the very front line of the ground war, and I controlled several flights of A-10s, one flights of F-16s, and I mentioned that I talked to but did not actually control an AC-130, which was handed off to me. So I talked to them, but I didn't have any targets for them at the time, so I just turned them back and said, hey, go talk to somebody else that may have a target for you. But I did control several flights of A-10s and one flight of F-16s. F-16s were dropping cluster bombs, and we dropped them on an artillery position. And the A-10s employed cluster bombs and the gun, and I believe, if I remember well, the Maverick one time. But that was my experience. So yes, I did. It was pretty exciting actually. And you were there, and my biggest concern when I did that, to tell the truth, was avoiding any fratricide. So, because we were winning the war, everybody knew that we were, by that time, that was the last full day of the ground war. We had won already. So my biggest concern was to make absolutely sure that the targets I was handing off to the fighters were, not too close or were not friendly, because we did have, not in my unit, but during Desert Storm as a whole, there were a few, not very many, but a few incidents of fratricide. One of them, involving an A-10 destroying a Marine Corps APC in a CAFG, battle for CAFG. Another one with the A-10 destroying a British Warrior infantry fighting vehicle and killing, I think, everybody on board, like 10 people. There was another one with an AH-64 shooting in a hellfire at one of our own Bradleys, and I think 1 or 2 people died in that one. So that was real. Thankfully, nothing like that happened in my case, but that was my biggest concern by far. So, I was willing to just call off the aircraft if I had any doubt in my mind that the target might not be properly identified, and there was any chance that they would drop on the friendlies. So John Didsbury asks, did you like the slant back seat of the F-16 as opposed to a regular vertical seat? So yeah, the F-16 was a first aircraft that had a 30 degrees tilted back seat. I thought it was great, personally. Now, most people loved it. It was very comfortable. It did help you sustain more G's easily because your legs were higher up than in a normal seat. So to me, I think it would have been hard to go back to an airplane that had later on I did, we can get into that. When I was an A-29 instructor in a simulator only, I never flew the A-29 per se. That's the Tucano, well, Super Tucano, the Embraer. I actually was a simulator instructor in that aircraft in Afghanistan for a year and a half, and I flew the simulator that many times. And then I got used to it, center stick, and it was no big deal. But I kind of really like the reclined seat, and in my opinion, it really did help you sustain more G's. So the one thing is people complain sometimes is like when you're looking back behind you at something maybe doing defensive maneuvers. It was more stressful on your neck because you really couldn't. Well, you could rest your head on the headrest, but then your head was kind of pinned back, and it was harder to move. So I don't know. I didn't think that was that big of a problem, but overall, I liked it a lot. And the only aircraft, well, in modern aircraft, the Rafale has actually a slightly more inclined. I think it's 32 degrees as opposed to 30. On the F-22 and F-35, they went kind of like halfway, so they have a little bit reclined seat, but not nearly as much as the F-16. So it's more like 20 degrees or something. It's kind of not as inclined. So I guess that's probably based on overall pilot inputs. But I personally liked it. Timberwolf has an interesting question. So it's about UFOs being investigated by the U.S. Congress. Have you or your fellows ever seen or been vectored against anything strange? Yeah, like the F-18 cruise on the Nimitz and all that. Personally, no. And I actually don't know anybody personally in my squadrons that ever came back and said, oh, I saw something like really strange that I can't explain. So I really cannot. Now, I've seen the videos from the F-18s, and I obviously it's strange. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I have no explanation for it. It is what it is. But personally, no, I don't have any stories to relate, or direct secondhand stories even from fellow pilots or aircrew that would have seen something like that. Seen plenty of shooting stars at night and stuff like that, but nothing that I might, consider to be a UFO. Unfortunately, that's all I can tell you. Next question, SPQR77. What do you think of the Dassault Rafale? I have a very high opinion of the Dassault Rafale. And maybe I'm biased because I'm, half French, I guess, but I think it's a very well-designed aircraft. Now, when people say, well, it's superior to the F-35, that's when I kind of part ways and say, well, in some ways it might be, but overall the F-35 is a far superior aircraft for modern air combat. But for a fourth generation plus fighter, I think it's very well designed. Excellent as a multi-role. I think it probably is somewhat inferior to the, and that's even debatable, but you could argue somewhat inferior to the Eurofighter in the air-to-air role. But even then, the Rafale right now was designed with the passive electronically scanned array radar, and now is being upgraded to an active array. And the Eurofighter still does not have that, which to me, in 2021, is just an unforgivable defect. I mean, that's just beyond comprehension. I know they're working on it, and I know it will eventually get it, but the fact that it doesn't have it right now is just unbelievable to me. That's a huge disadvantage, huge, in modern air combat. So, but the Rafale, it's as a multi-role aircraft, so maybe in air-to-air you could argue potentially, a little less than the Eurofighter, but as a multi-role fighter, I think it's much more capable, has a longer range, has a better overall design. What I've taught when I talk to Rafale pilots, I've never flown it, but I have interacted many times in person, face to face, with Rafale pilots from the French Air Force. And one of the things they thought, and this has changed over the years, so because avionics keep being improved and software improvements can change this pretty quick, but the aircraft pilot interface and the systems integration in the Rafale was much better than on the Eurofighter. So again, that may have changed over the last few years, but that's the feedback I got. And again, this is kind of secondhand, so where the truth lies. But I do think the Rafale is a fantastic aircraft. Now, it's not really fifth generation. So it's hard to say in combat against a peer enemy force like the Russians or the Chinese with very advanced SAMs and very advanced air-to-air threats. How it would do. A lot of it depends on very classified characteristics, especially like electronic warfare capabilities, which I can't talk about. Even if I knew about it, I couldn't talk about it because it would be classified. But I honestly don't know. So all I hear is it's supposed to be already good, but how good against like an S-400 or the new S-500 Russian systems, I have no idea. So hopefully that answers the question. So now we have Alexander Vater or Vater. What were your main means of lead in your air assets? Lead. I'm not sure exactly what the question means. Oh, okay. Well, so yeah, to actually talk to the aircraft. So back then, it was still mostly a radio communications. We had secure radios, so now, in modern FAC world, and at the time we were called FACs, so forward air controllers. The modern nomenclature now is JTAC, Joint Terminal Attack Controller, but it's the same function basically. So just different acronyms. But now they have ways to digitally, directly, without talking on the radio, pass, like let's say target coordinates and laser codes to an aircraft in the air. There are even means to show pictures of the target, and that goes both ways. So the aircraft can take a picture or show the video from its targeting pod to the FAC and say, hey, does this look like the target? And the FAC can say, yep, that's it, or vice versa. So the FAC could pass a picture of the target to the aircraft. So it's very much more advanced now than when I was doing it. Back then, we basically had to talk the pilot's eyes onto the target, and I've done it from both ends. I've been a FAC on the ground talking to a CAS asset in the air, trying to talk to them to where the target is, making sure we didn't have any fratricide. And I've also done CAS in the F-16, talking to a ground FAC, trying to get my eyes on the target. So in Korea, just to mention, I don't think we mentioned that in the interviews, but when I was flying the F-16C in Korea, the Black 30, we actually did quite a lot of CAS in an area called P518, which is right at the border of North Korea, so just south of that. In fact, you have to be very careful not to fly into North Korea because you could get in big trouble. And so we'd go to P518, which was the actual areas where we would have to do CAS in case of an invasion from the north into the south. And we would work with ground FACs all the time there. And at the time, I was checked out in the Maverick, AGM-65 Maverick missile. And that was one of our main weapons. But I employed, dry CAS, so nothing live, not actually shooting anything, but doing dry CAS with FACs in that area. And it was very, very interesting, and so at the time, it's the mid 90s, it was still mostly talking on the radios, and that's it. But now again, now much more advanced systems, and it doesn't matter whether it's US or allies, they do have systems that are way, way better than what we used to have and makes the job easier, but still, it's a very difficult job to do. So, even though it's become, I would say, easier, it's still not easy. So now, Bergaren 5, hope, again, I'm pronouncing that correctly, asks, how fast could the F-111 go at low altitudes like 5,000 feet? I mentioned that a little bit in my F-111 video. Um, at 5,000 feet altitude, at sea level, the limit was 1.2 Mach, which was 800 knots indicated airspeed. Or maybe it was calibrated airspeed. There's not much difference between indicated and calibrated, but technically there is a small difference. But 800 knots, 1.2 Mach at sea level. At 5,000 feet, you could go about 1.4 or so, which was the altitude at Nellis in the red flag ranges, was around 5,000 foot pressure altitude. So that's how fast you could go. I've also been supersonic at low altitude in the F-16, by the way, but not nearly as often as in the 111. So hope that answers that question. And of course, the higher you go, the faster you can go. You know, it has to do with pressure, altitude, and drag and things like that. It also depended, of course, now if you were loaded with a full load of ordnance, no, you couldn't go that fast. When I say 1.4 Mach at 5,000 foot altitude, that's on a clean air. Well, clean. Let's caveat that it was just pylon. So no more. The bombs have been dropped. You don't have any ordnance, you know, that you're carrying. All you have is the pylons and maybe the multiple ejection racks. Which, by the way, multiple ejection racks in the F-111 were not called MERS or MERs, multiple ejection racks. They were called BRUs, B-R-U. Stands for Bomb Rack Unit. And they were slightly different. Same principle, so you could put like 6 Mark 82s on one rack, just like on the MER, but the BRUs were supersonic capable. They actually, you know, they were specifically used, I think they were only used on the F-111. Whereas MERS are used on a bunch of other types of aircraft. So same basic idea, but it was very specific to the 111. So, but with that caveat, you know, on a relatively clean airplane, yeah, you could go very fast. So Anthony Furnival asks, was it the F-111 you could dump fuel from? Yeah, that's a good question. Dump fuel from and create a huge flame coming from the back of the airplane. Yes, indeed. Now, this was the term we used for that was called torching. And did I ever get to do this? Yes, I have. Now, okay, let's talk about this. In the U.S. Air Force, this was only allowed in the case of an emergency, technically. So if you had to dump fuel, and let's say you lost an engine, so you were limited on thrust, and so you had to use afterburner on the good engine, you know, let's say to climb or to remain at the altitude you were, then this was allowed. I admit a couple of times, and the time I remember using it, you know, not in an emergency, so to speak, but because I kind of needed to, was I was doing a night, it was actually twilight, but it was starting to get dark, departure from mountain home, and I actually, my wingman behind me, so we were departing in trail formation, so my wingman is like maybe 3 or 4 miles behind me, departing the airfield, and he says, hey, I lost sight of you. I can't reach on you because he lost sight of me. So I said, okay, watch this. And I had my Wizzo dump fuel for just a couple of seconds. And he said, oh, okay, I see you now. Because obviously with that huge flame, which was about 2 or 3 times the length of the airplane behind, and there are plenty of YouTube videos of the Australians doing it because they, unlike us, which, you know, in the U.S. Air Force, we were only allowed to use it in emergency situations. They would do it all the time at air shows and whatnot. So, but yes, that was a very cool thing that not too many airplanes can do. So, in fact, maybe only the F-111 can do it. Off the top of my head, I can't name another airplane that can do that, but I could be wrong. So I hope that answers the questions. So now we're down to 999 Razor again, who asks, how did you define yourself against a good initial turn fighter in the F-16 in a neutral merge? Yeah, well, the first thing is if you can force. Now, this is not necessarily easy to do. You know, it's easy to say, but obviously you go 2 circle. So now that, you know, that means that it's kind of the default. Most 2 circles is going to be the default thing because what the tendency is as you merge towards each other, the tendency is going to be to turn towards the other airplane, so to close the gap. So you're going to turn like this, and automatically you're going to be in a two circle. But if, like I said, the Mirage 2000 is smart, he might fake it, like you're going to do two circle, but then reverse and go one circle against me. And because of his initial turn rate being faster, he may be able to get a shot on me if I don't detect that and go the other way. So for sure in the F-16, the normal tactic was I want to try to force a two-circle fight against an aircraft that has a better instantaneous turn rate. The other tactic you can do, but that depends on the thrust to weight ratio of the aircraft. And against the Mirage 2000, for example, that could work. Although, I mean, you still have to be careful to go vertical instead of turning horizontal. The vertical and try to use the vertical on your superior thrust to weight ratio to try to gain separation that way. But even then, that doesn't guarantee victory. You have to be very, very careful, and the key is to keep an eye on what the other guy's doing, and kind of gauge, which again is easier said than done. It's very easy to lose fight, and in fighter combat, especially in the area of jet fighters, because the speeds and the turn radii are quite a bit larger than it would have been, let's say, in a Spitfire versus an ME-109, or a BF-109. So it can get tough to keep sight, but say lose sight, lose fight. That's true. And so if you can keep sight and gauge what the other guy is doing, then you can take appropriate action. So in the F-16, you want to use your higher sustained turn rate as much as possible, and your higher thrust to weight ratio as much as possible. And again, you have to remember, like, thrust to weight ratios do vary with altitude. So when I say the F-16 has a higher thrust to weight ratio than the Mirage 2000, for example, that is true at low and medium altitudes. But actually, if you go up to like 35, 40,000 feet, because the Mirage 2000 has variable air intakes that tend to optimize the flow of air to the engine, at very high altitude, the Mirage 2000 actually has a higher thrust to weight ratio than the F-16, because the F-16 has a fixed air intake. So, you do have to be careful when you say, general statements like, oh, F-16 has a higher thrust to weight ratio. Well, that's true in most of the flight envelope, but there are areas where you could get in trouble if that's your assumption to start with at all altitude, because that's not true. So the Mirage 2000, for example, has a somewhat higher top speed than the F-16, and it's all due, even though it has a lower thrust to weight ratio, but again, fixed air intake versus variable ramp air intake, that'll make a big difference in some flight regimes. So now we're back to Anthony Furnival. Hypothetical. You're tasked by the U.S. Air Force to replace the F-16. You are told that the replacement has to be non-American built and in service. Which aircraft would you pick and why? Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, obviously, I think, I don't know. If you're non-American, if we can buy Russian planes, I think something like the Su-57 might be pretty good. But okay, I'm going to assume the question leads more to like the Rafale, the Eurofighter, those types of airplanes. Because not talking about the future thing like the Tempest, so things are just on paper right now. There's not even a prototype flying, so I'm not even going to address those because who knows what's going to happen. Or like the future combat aircraft, for the French and the Germans, who knows. So I'm ignoring that, and it has to be well, actually, your question does say it has to be already in service, so that addresses that question. I don't know. Honestly, I think if we're leading to like Eurofighter versus Rafale, I have a bias in favor of the Rafale because I think it's better as a multi-role aircraft. Now that's debatable. You could argue all day long. there are pros and cons. The Eurofighter is a little bit more powerful, a little bit more thrust to weight, but I don't think that's a decisive factor anymore in air combat. I mean, obviously you want a good thrust to weight ratio, but I don't think an extra 10% will get you what you need. I think there are other factors. So personally, I'm biased towards the Rafale. It has an AESA radar in service today, which is a huge. Again, I'm at a loss to explain whether Eurofighter doesn't have that capability. The Rafale has the recline seat. It has a side stick controller, which the Eurofighter does not have, and I understand the reasons. But I don't know. To me, I would prefer to fly the Rafale. That's my personal choice. So. They said the Russians and the Chinese have some pretty good equipment. If that's in play, I kind of like the Su-57. So I love the Su-27, Su-30 series of aircraft as well. So, but I think they look awesome. But the capabilities, there's some pros and cons, So anyway, but I'll admit maybe I'm biased, but the Rafale is great to me.
So, Karl, I'm just going to interrupt here. Maybe,
yes.
Are you able to go on to for another 20 minutes, quarter past?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. Enjoy, guys.
Okay. So I hope that answered the question. There are choices. I mean, the Chinese have some good aircraft like the J-20, the J-10. These might, they might be contenders too. Unfortunately, we don't know as much about those that we know from like the Rafale and Eurofighter. So it's difficult. And then, without having access to the classified information, it's always difficult to answer those questions. Okay, so thank you, Alexander Fader, for your comments. For your thanks. And it's my pleasure, really. I love aviation in general, and I can relate to people who have the same passion for aircraft. So Anthony Furnival, again, if you could fly any aircraft, past or present, that you have not yet flown, what would it be and why? That's a great question. I have two answers. Okay, so a past aircraft that I would have loved to fly. Actually, it was when I was growing up as a teenager, that was kind of like my dream fighter was the F-14 Tomcat. Okay, so behind me there's a big model of one. I love that aircraft. I said in my interview, in the F-16 against an F-14 in a visual fight, the F-16 should win. Assuming the pilots are equal. Some of the F-14 pilots were very good and, could beat an F-16 here and there, but overall, the F-16 was a better dogfighter than the A model anyway. Again, I can't really talk to the B and D model that had the more powerful engine, but I just love the F-14. So it's just my childhood love, and I would have loved to fly that. I actually started asking about that, but when I went to ROTC, the Navy ROTC offered me a scholarship in college, but they could not guarantee me a pilot slot. So what they were saying is, well, you're an engineer, you're studying engineering. We have a deal for you. We'll pay for all your school, and we give you a bonus when you sign up, a cash bonus, when you join. But you have to be a nuclear engineer on submarines or something like that. I was like, thank you very much. That's not what I was looking for. And then I went to the Air Force side, and they say, yeah, we can talk, and they couldn't immediately guarantee a pilot slot, but they said, okay, well, take all the tests, and my grades were very good. And then after 3 months, they came back and said, yep, we're offering you a scholarship that guarantees that you will attend pilot training. And this was a no-brainer for me. I said, okay, well, Navy cannot guarantee me anything. Well, they can guarantee me a commission and a scholarship, but they wouldn't guarantee me going to fly fighters. The Air Force, didn't guarantee flying fighters, but they would guarantee me that I would attend pilot training. They wouldn't guarantee me I would graduate from pilot training, but at least they guaranteed me I could attend and try my best. So, I went with the Air Force, and of course that took the F-14 out of the equation. Although still, in theory, I could have had an exchange tour to the Navy. I know some guys did get that. I don't know anybody personally. The only guys I know personally that got exchange tours with the Navy for 3 years, they ended up flying because they were in the 111. So the logical aircraft to go to was the A6 Intruder. So I personally know guys that went from the F-111 to the A6 and flew for the Navy for 3 years and then came back to the Air Force. And one of them, actually, Kevin Kriegel, ended up being a space shuttle pilot. He ended up going to the Navy, then he went to test pilot school, I think with the Navy at Pax River. And then he ended up applying for astronaut training. He was received, and he ended up flying the space shuttle like 3 or 4 times. So I didn't keep in touch with him, but he was at Lake and Heath at the time I was flying with him in the 111. So, but then the next part of the question would be, okay, today I would love to fly the F-22. So with a close second being the F-35, these would be my two choices. I think the F-22 has a bit of an edge just because of pure aerodynamic performance. But on the systems point of view, the F-35 would have an edge, but that would be a tough choice. But I'd say the F-22, I guess. That this just, and people debate this all the time. Is it the best fighter? In my opinion, yeah, it's the best right now, and still for the foreseeable future. Its only downside is its range is not the best, as compared to an F-35. F-35 has way more range. But again, with tankers around and stuff like that, you can make up for that. So F-22. So F-14 and F-22. Now, the Freckle Puny, or Punny, which other fighter or bomber would you have given your left arm to fly? Well, I just answered that, I guess F-22. But the other part of his question is different. He says, which Soviet-Russian type would you have liked to try out? Yeah, that's a good question. I first saw Freedom both flying and in person. I went to the Paris Air Show in 1989. At the time, I was stationed at Hahn Air Base in Germany. So me and a friend drove to Paris to see the Paris Air Show, and this was the first Paris Air Show where the Russians. Well, they were still the Soviets at that time in 1989. It was right before the transition, before the Soviet Union was dissolved. So they brought both the Su-27 and the MiG-29. In fact, the MiG-29 crashed. Now, I wasn't there the day that the MiG-29 crashed and the pilot ejected safely, but still, I've seen the videos of that many times. But I was there like a couple of days later. And I got to see firsthand in flight and on the ground the MiG-29 and the Su-27, and they're very, very impressive airplanes. I think these are, were and still are to some extent fantastic airplanes, particularly with avionics upgrades. Like the Su-35, I think is a great airplane. They do have limitations, but the biggest limitation of the Russian airplanes right now is their lack of targeting pods, and they don't seem to employ precision guided munitions like as much as we do in the West. So they're still, like, if you see their operations in Syria, still using a lot of unguided bombs. It's not only that, but I don't know. I think they're behind on that front. Their targeting pods are nowhere near as advanced as what we have, or even what the Chinese have, and so that would be a disadvantage for them. But from a pure aerodynamic performance, any of the thrust vectored versions of the Su-27 family are just totally awesome. I just love the way these aircraft look. I have a lot of them in my aircraft model collection. I have a lot of the flankers, of various kinds in there, because I think they look cool. And so that might be a candidate, something that we'd have loved to fly. Of course, now the Su-57 is very intriguing, and I think it's also a very cool looking airplane. And when you see it flying a display at an air show, it's very impressive. Now, again, we don't know the full capabilities. A lot of it, there's no way to really know 100%. But that would be something that would be tempting. So let's see. Back to Anthony Furnival. Obviously, with jets being a machine of war, how do you disconnect emotionally from when you have to make a kill? It can't be that easy. Yeah, I guess, that's something you have to just accept very early in your career. If you're going to fly fighters, if you have a problem with that, you can still fly in the Air Force, just go fly transports or something. Yeah. But in a way, you're still helping the war effort. So even though you might not be killing anybody directly, and I know that, psychologically, that it's a huge difference. So don't get me wrong, I'm not dismissing the point. That's something very early on, when you say, okay, I want to go fly a fighter plane, you know, that you have to take it seriously. And if you're not comfortable with that, then, you know, this is not the career field for you. So go do something else because, you know, to me, I've never had a problem personally with the idea of killing bad guys. You know, when I say bad guys, that's a very generic term. You know, and in real life, it can get, well, sometimes it is that easy. Okay. Uh, so sometimes it's pretty clear cut. You know, somebody rapes a child, bad guy. I have no problem with calling that person a bad guy. Okay, I don't care what anybody else says. Yeah, they're a human being, but they're a bad. They're a bad person, and they deserve every punishment they're gonna get. Sometimes, you know, it can get a lot more complex than that. So it's not always that easy, but you just have to accept. And quite frankly, in actual combat, I would not have hesitated. I mean, it's just, you know, it's like, but I'll give you an example. Like when I was a FAC in Desert Storm, so okay, you do feel sorry for the guys on the ground, the Iraqi, you know, enlisted conscripts that were there. They didn't ask to be there, but you know, some of them are going to be killed if I call an airstrike on them. But you know, in some ways, it's like it's not my problem. It's you know, they have a regime, and this is where you come into the, you know, the thing about, if you don't like your regime, you know, it's up to you to get rid of it. I mean, there was an American Revolution, there was a French Revolution, there have been revolutions and revolts throughout the world. Now, at some point, you have to say, hey, either I accept the status quo and I roll with the punches, and you know, it's just bad. But to me, there was no hesitation. You know. I'm not saying there wouldn't be some cases potentially where it would be more difficult. It's possible, but then you have to listen to your conscience, and if you have, then you know, you just have to resign. You know, so just, you know, just say, hey, I can't do this, and accept the consequences. But that's it. So let's see. Next question. Back to Alexander Vater. That sounds super interesting. I spent 2 hours in Afghanistan. My second one in Kabul. Yeah, I was in Kabul at HKIA. Yeah, I was at Hamid Karzai International Airport on the NATO side, working with my buddies. There's a lot of French guys. They're not French Army, but former French Army or French Air Force. How was your impression of the Afghan pilots? So I trained pilots in the A-29, but only in the simulator. So I want to make this clear. I never actually flew in the actual A-29. I was hired as a contractor to run the simulator at Kabul, and I would go there for 3 months at a time, and then come back home for 3 months, and you know, there's this rotation. I was hired to do that in the simulator there, so I would train the Afghan pilots in the simulator, mostly for like instrument procedures and emergency procedures, stuff like that. Although the simulator there had a visual, and it was capable of doing, you know, replication of tactical missions like dropping bombs as strafing, things like that. But the main use of the simulator was mostly for emergency procedure training and instrument flying training. And the Afghan pilots, it depended. Some of them were very, very good, just almost, you could say as good as, you know, the average, let's say, American pilots. They had a lot of experience in previous airplanes. But these were like the first batches of pilots that we trained. They tended to be pretty good, with a few exceptions here and there, but tended to be pretty good, particularly in an airplane like the A-29. But then later on, as you know, more and more later classes, they had to dig deeper and deeper into their pool of available pilots, and the later classes tended to have a lot of weaker, you know, marginal pilots. Some of them sometimes didn't make it to the program, but overall, you know, they were okay. And I actually feel very bad for them now. I don't know. I have no idea how many were evacuated or not. But these guys' lives under the Taliban now are in extreme danger. I hope they were all evacuated. That's all. I have no idea. I have no idea. But I pray that, you know, I'm not a religious person, but I pray nevertheless that they got out of there, because even when I was there, there were assassination attempts against them. So I don't have to tell you that now under the current regime, these guys' lives are in extreme danger. So let's see. A question Anthony again asked, you have an amazing model collection behind you. Which one is your favorite? Well, I guess the big F-14 probably, but I don't have very many that are that size. That's a 1/18 scale. JSI F-14. If you look for it on eBay these days, because they haven't made it for a long time, I paid like $300 for it when it was new, but now they're worth like well over $1,000 used, because that's very rare now, and it's one of my favorite models. Period. But I have if you could see my entire collection, I have about 750 aircraft displayed in my collection here. Most of them, the vast majority, are under glass or they're in display cases, but some of them are outside because they're just too big. Yeah, I love that collection. I started collecting way back, and it has to do, with my love for aviation in general and aviation history. So I have anything from like the most current, like F-22s or anything like that, to World War I aircraft in my collection. So I have a lot of like Sopwith Camels, Type 13s. Well, a lot. I have quite a few, let's say, but not nearly as much as World War II or Korean War and modern aircraft or Cold War, but about 750 aircraft. And I also have quite a few tanks and ground vehicles displayed as well, because I have an interest in that, in military history in general. So let's see, next question. So Timberwolf asks, wait a second, did I skip something here? Oh yeah, so Timberwolf, torching was recreated in the hit science fiction. Okay, that's just a remark, it's not a question. Real quick, which was the easiest, hardest to in-flight refuel? F-111, F-16, same. I didn't see much of a difference. In both cases, the refueling receptacle was behind the cockpit, so it's pretty much the same. I didn't think there was much of a difference. So Alexander Vetter asked us, is that a Knight's Cross on the 109 painting? Well, it's not a real one, because a real one would cost a lot of money, so it's a reproduction. Yeah, that painting is actually signed, autographed in person by both Adolf Galland and Eric Hartmann. So before, of course, this dates back. I acquired this way back when I was in Germany, and it's been autographed by both of these legends. So Eric Hartmann, of course, they both passed away now, but at the time they were able to autograph this. I wasn't there. I wasn't present, just to be clear. I was not present when they autographed the picture, but the guy who sold it to me, who became a friend of mine, is a British guy who, that was his business. He was selling collectibles like this. And so he sold me this, and so these are actual autographs. And, again, I just go attest to my love for aviation history. And the one above that is P-51 hunting Tiger tanks.
So yeah,
so Mike,
Karl,
I see your friendly face. That means we're at the end of this.
Well, I was going to say, like, if you pick maybe two more questions to wrap up this
I can go for
amazing
10 more minutes. That's about all I can do.
Yeah, if you can, pick two more questions, and then we're going to wrap up this amazing Q&A. That'll be great, Karl.
Okay. So let's see. Actual question. Some people are commenting. Thank you for all the kind comments, by the way. I really appreciate it. But I try my best, to convey my love of aviation, and military aviation in particular. In my collection, by the way, military aviation, it's almost all military. I only have like 3 civilian models. I have an A380 Lufthansa, I have a 747 Lufthansa, and a Air France Concorde. These are, I think, there's only 3 civilian aircraft in my collection. So everything else is military. But let's see, a question. So Balaz Molnar, again, sorry if I don't pronounce your name correctly, but could be used in case of need, Cold War situation, CAS support plane, the F-111. Yeah. I mean, I actually did like 2 or 3 CAS missions in the F-111, including one with live ordnance, amazingly enough. This was all for training, not in wartime, but training missions. But it was, out of the hundreds of missions that I did in the 111, only like 2 or 3 CAS missions. So obviously this was not our primary mission. It was kind of very cumbersome to use in the casserole because of its turn radius not being very good and very high speeds, and So, and on top of that, we couldn't use the gun. So I mentioned in my interview, the A model had the gun in it, but we didn't use it. It wasn't even maintained, which was kind of sad. And moving targets in the 111, when the F-111F, and actually it never did cast in the F-111, but with the laser-guided bombs, you could have dealt with moving targets up to a point, as long as they weren't like really fast moving targets, because that would have been much tougher. But you could to some extent. But in the other 111, really moving targets would have been way too hard to handle. I mean, um, and I'm afraid we were pretty much limited to fixed targets. So that's the easiest answer to say that. It could have dealt with moving targets to some point, but we would have been, our PK would have been very, very, very low against those. So it's not impossible, but not good. And what weapons would be used? I'll say for in the F-111F would be laser-guided bombs would be the best for cast for sure by far. So GBU-12 or GBU-10s, and later on with GBU-24 paved way 2, which was actually the best, but that's a big bomb, 2,000 pounder. So frag would go, for fratricide or collateral damage. You'd have to be careful with that. But typically we were pretty limited. Like we never had the Maverick missile on the F-111, so that I did fly with the Maverick in the F-16 later on. That was a good cast weapon. If you ask me, a little too big for what its intended use was, so it limited the number you could carry, but very accurate, very good, very useful. But we never carried the Maverick in the F-111. So hope that answers the question. Somebody asked, so funny, how can I buy an F-16 from my garage? Yeah, well, good luck with that. So. Although there
Well,
is a adversary air company. I can't remember if it's ATAC or Draken Aerospace. One of those companies that are civilian for hire to do adversary air for the Air Force and the Navy. They are buying F-16s for Israel right now. So second-hand F-16s to do adversary air. So. It's my pleasure. If you want to do another one, just give me a call. So, um, and I love, so you can see, I love talking about aviation, military aviation in general, any era. I've read a lot, and I have my opinions about this. But yeah, it's always a great pleasure to talk to people that enjoy it as much as I do. Well, it's afternoon here. Yeah, it's afternoon. All right.